Hey everybody, welcome. My name is David Bell and I am the host of this interview, the guest host here on Authors on the Air, and I'm really pleased to be here. I really feel fortunate to get to chat today with Richard Chizmar, who is here. You can see him right there on the other half of the screen. We're really here because just last week, Richard's book, Chasing the Boogeyman, came out. Getting all sorts of wonderful acclaim and attention, as it should. I love to be able to say this. I was fortunate to read an early version of the book, an early copy of the book, and it really did blow me away. It's a great book. If you haven't read that yet, you've still got time to go buy one and check it out. I'm just going to give a real quick introduction of Rich, and then we're just going to chat wherever the conversation goes. The conversation goes about writing or whatever, or maybe, I don't know if Rich wants to talk about the Baltimore Orioles season. No, he doesn't want to. So we'll avoid that topic, I guess. But so real quick, I'll just tell you a little about Richard. He is the co-author with a guy named Stephen King of the New York Times bestselling novella, Gwendy's Button Box. He's published a number of story collections like The Girl on the Porch, The Long Way Home, The Long December. His stories have appeared in a number of different publications and best of anthologies. He has won 2 World Fantasy Awards, 4 International Horror Guild Awards. He's a speaker at conferences and workshops. That's how I first met him. I went to a writing workshop many thousands of years ago, and Rich was one of the teachers there, and he was very kind and encouraging to me, and he was that way to everybody. So anyway, that's the deal on Rich. You can find him online, richardchizmar.com. He's on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Rich, how are you doing today? Welcome.
I'm good. Thanks for asking me to do this.
Well, you know, I had the opportunity to ask someone to come on here and chat with, and your book was coming out. And like I said, I was able to read your book before it came out. I thought it was just one of the best books I've read this year. I'm not saying that just because you're sitting here. It's one of the things about writing in suspense and mystery and horror and all those genres is it's really hard to do something original. It's really hard to come up with something original. Right. And I think you did it here. You actually came up with a book that is really original. Do you want to just talk a little bit about the concept behind this book and what makes it so unique?
You know, I'll admit first, right out of the gate, that it was an accidental. You know, it was one of those happy accidents that made it so original. I would love to be able to like hold up a dated outline from 2 years back and say this is brilliant. This was my brilliant plan all along. But it just kind of fell in my lap. I always knew I wanted to write a novel set in my hometown. You know, I grew up in a place called Edgewood in Maryland. Very much a working class blue collar town, a military town. We're surrounded by 2 military bases. And it's in Harford County in Maryland. And we're kind of the, Edgewood was, back in '88 was kind of considered the wrong side of the tracks for a lot of people. You know, we weren't one of the more affluent neighborhoods. Like I said, we're definitely blue collar. And I always knew I wanted to write a book set there because I had a great childhood, still close with a bunch of my childhood friends, very much like scenes out of, Stephen King's The Body or Stand By Me. We were always outside, always together. And, but I always figured it was going to be a big, scary horror book like, It or Dan Simmons' Summer and Night. But I couldn't shake this idea for a crime novel. And just to give you a brief, non-rambling, hopefully, insight into where the novel came from. Back in the late 80s in Edgewood, there was a guy breaking into homes, usually through open doors, unlocked doors or windows at night. And he was caressing the women, their hair or their legs or their arms while they were sleeping. And when they woke up, obviously startled, scared to death, he would just take off and disappear into the night. And the guy did this like 30 times and was never caught. And the newspapers started calling him the Phantom Fondler, which everyone talked about. Mm-hmm. And I remember our little town, it was like being in a horror movie. People started buying deadlocks and floodlights, and obviously they started locking their doors and windows, and there were more police patrols, and there were rumors that people were setting traps outside their houses, and people were buying guns, and the guy was never caught. Eventually he was arrested in the 90s in Baltimore City for an unrelated crime, and he admitted to these break-ins, and they had evidence which matched up, so they knew he was telling the truth. But that time period always stuck in my mind. And back during the summer of '88, I had just graduated from college, and I was engaged to be married. And Kara and I, my fiance, we decided that instead of getting an apartment, then we would wait until we got married, and I would move back home and save some money for 9 months until the wedding. So it was a really interesting time. I was fresh out of college. I was working on the first issue of Cemetery Dance. I was writing horrible short stories and submitting them everywhere. And some of the horrible stories were actually selling. And here I was kind of on the threshold of adulthood, yet I was moving back into the house I grew up in. I was having dinner every night with my parents. And this madman was, running around town at night, terrorizing, the women in Edgewood. So immediately, my brain turned it, immediately, kind of looked at it and said, what if this guy's actions, what if he escalated like they often do? And instead of just caressing, he was murdering people. So that's a really long-winded way of describing, where kind of how I came up with the idea. And then, what you're talking about, the, kind of the storytelling format I chose was, I'm a big true crime fan. So I knew at some point I wanted to write a book that was set, that was formatted as a true crime, book. And that's what I chose to do with Chasing the Boogeyman. I at the end of each chapter, there are photographs. I didn't want to advertise the photographs because I wanted the reader to just turn the pages, get to the end of a chapter, see these pictures, actually get a visual of the places that they've just read about and the people. And that's kind of, it all just kind of fell in my lap. It's the way the story really needed to be told.
And those photos that are in there, are those photos you took, and are those of your actual town? Like you're using? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The photo, I show, a photo of the house I grew up in. That's it. The library I went to all the time as a kid. I tried to make it as realistic as possible. In my mind, I really did write a true crime book. I was too lazy to do all the research on a real crime. So I made it up. I had the best of both worlds, like I said, I'm a big true crime fan, and I always really respect the writers who do that, because I think they go to a place that is pretty deep and dark to write these books. And the amount of research they do has to just be overwhelming. So yeah, I've always joked that I want to write a true crime book, but I can't deal with all that research. So this was my chance to just make it up.
Well, I've read reviews, things people wrote on Goodreads and other reviews, and I had this experience when I read the book that I would find myself believing that the book was true,
right?
Because of the photos and the way it was written. I would find myself believing that this was really happening, not in the way that you're supposed to believe that fiction is happening, but I found myself thinking this was nonfiction, and
right.
I had to remind myself this is fiction meant to look like nonfiction. So it had the effect of messing with my head as a reader, which was one of the pleasures of the book.
Well, when you so kindly read an early version, it didn't have the afterword, which the publisher asked me to include. That kind of gives you a glimpse behind the curtain and answers some questions that I'm sure readers have floating around in their head. So you didn't get a chance to read that, and nor did any of the other writers who were kind enough to provide me with blurbs. And there's one gentleman, I won't mention his name, brilliant writer, great guy. I guess I didn't explain to him well enough ahead of time that it was, a combination of fact and fiction, but it was indeed a novel. And he wrote back and gave me a wonderful blurb and had a list of questions because he believed it to be real. And I had to go after the fact that, it was a little embarrassing for me, not him, to have to say, I made that part up, all the stuff about myself is pretty accurate, but the rest of it came out of my imagination.
Well, it seems like the perfect format for a book now. The reason I was saying it was original is because there's always been true crime writing for a long time. And,
Right.
and now we're in this wave in the last however many years of true crime podcasts and true crime documentaries on Netflix and places like that. There's been a lot of that, but I don't know of anyone who's written a book quite like this, but this seems like the perfect next step.
Right.
In this true crime world we're in, is that now you would have books that are pretending to be true crime when they're actually fiction and messing.
Yeah, I'm in a mess out of all of this, I'm sure. And now it's going to be a mess. No one's going to know what to believe. But that was my original intention. The phrase I've used all along is I wanted to Blair Witch everybody.
Right.
I wanted to, my original plan was the version you read, I believe it was titled just The Boogeyman, and it had a subtitle, A True Story of Small Town Horror. That's what I wanted on the book. The only one who had an early inkling that this might not be such a good idea was my oldest son, Billy, who's also a writer. And he was pretty adamant. And I was amused by it because he's usually not a warrior, but he's like, Dad, you can't try to pass this off as real. You're going to lower property values in Edgewood and you're going to get people upset. And I was just like, no, Billy, I'm going to, the plan was I was going to plant a fake website online, have it be dated like 1993 and it be incomplete. Like it was never updated, continued to be updated. I was going to plant some fake newspaper articles. And then I really wanted Billy, who's also a filmmaker, I wanted him to do a documentary, kind of like the one they did for the Blair Witch Project, which kind of explained the background of the curse and the witch.
Right.
And I wanted to do like a half an hour documentary that people could Google and find online. But once we sold the book to Simon & Schuster, they really quickly, legal department was like, no, we're going to have a disclaimer page. And it's good that you have this afterwards, which explains it. And they put a novel on the front cover, which was fine. But it would have been more fun if I was trying to purposely screw with people.
I wish you had done all that. Because I found, like I said, as I was reading, even though I think I did know it was a novel, I found myself thinking, I need to Google this. I need to see what really happened with this. I need to, so I think that would be interesting. So yeah, I think they should have let you do all that. I mean, if you'd been sued, it wouldn't have been my problem, right?
Yeah, but it would have been more fun.
Would have been entertaining for me, not for you, if that had all gone wrong. But yeah, no, so that's interesting. Well, so since you brought up this whole idea of part of the seed of this was living back in your hometown and writing about your hometown, and the book is set in 1988. It seems like I've noticed this in some of your other work, and it seems like a lot of, especially like horror fantasy, like the Ray Bradbury, Stephen King kind of vein of things. There is a lot of nostalgia in those stories, a lot of looking back, and I don't know, why do you think that is, that we look back to times when we're younger, or to a town when it was younger, and we write about it, but yet we are unearthing some horrific things sometimes when we do that? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I can only speak from myself that, I'm a really, happy, grateful guy for a guy in the 50s, in his 50s. I wake up every day, thankful for the life I have. So when I look back, it's not because I'm this miserable old guy who, is looking back and yearning for younger days. I think it's because, from that early age, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew, I talk about it in Chasing the Boogeyman. So for me, it's a little bit like stepping in that time machine and being able to go back with much more self-awareness that, hey, I am going to write about this one day. And also, you can't overlook just the simple, sentiment of, you're back with your friends. I saw a meme a couple months ago, and everyone is probably I'm a techno idiot and I'm slow online, even though I love the social media aspect. So everyone probably saw this like 5 years ago. I saw it 2 months ago, and it just floored me. There was a meme that said, at some point in your childhood, you and all your friends went outside and played together for the last time. Mm-hmm. And I just read that, and I was like, oh, how simple and true and powerful that is. Because like I said, I had a great childhood. It was very much like the Wonder Years. We played kick the can and wiffle ball, and we played marbles and traded baseball cards. And, we all knew about each other's first girlfriend and first kiss and all that. We were tight. And at some point, all that went away. So, you're looking back to those kind of days that, and again, the famous line from Stand By Me from King, essentially it says, you never had friends later on like the ones you did when you were 12. And even if you have great friends, in adulthood, how true is that statement? So I think a lot of looking back is just simply, if you were fortunate enough to have those things, it is just kind of looking back at a safe and happy place, even if you are a relatively, healthy and happy guy later on in life. And as far as readers, I think the same sentiment. I think a lot of them, they're busy, they're hustling, struggling, succeeding. None of it is easy. And you look back to childhood when you woke up and you ate breakfast and you opened your door at 8:30 in the morning, no cell phones.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of just everything was out there waiting for you. Who's the first friend you ran into? And then are we going to go to so-and-so's house? We can't go to his house. He has a doctor's appointment. But guess what? There was 5 other choices. And by the end of the day, you're all together and you're all sweaty and grass stained, and your parents are, it's okay to be out because the neighborhood's safe. So it was just a different time.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, have you heard from people in the town, these friends of yours and people who were there back in 1988 or in your childhood? Have you heard from them, people who've read the book and are like, hey, you got this right, you got this wrong, or this is so-and-so, or I know that's so-and-so?
I just heard all that kind of stuff? Absolutely. And I just answered a very lengthy message on Facebook about an hour ago from a woman who, we were friends when we grew up. She was a few years younger than me. And just the kindest note. She's actually on vacation writing me this note as she's about halfway through the book. And I told her, I said, when I finished this book, it was a very personal book. And when I finished it, I thought, I don't know if anyone's going to want to read this. I remember telling my son that. I was like, don't fret and worry about the whole, trying to pull a fast one, because I don't know whether 5 people are going to read this or 50,000. And that's not my concern. But I do remember when I was finished, I thought, this is such a personal story with so many personal, private memories of mine that, I'm, maybe no one will want to read it. But what I found is hearing from all these Edgewood folks who I grew up with, and folks who are much younger than me, but are, grew up in Edgewood, and many are still there, is that, I wasn't writing about just my own memories. I was writing about all of ours, because there's so many shared experiences there. I talk about the Myers house, the local haunted house in town. Guess what? People who are 20 years younger than me are still talking about that house as the haunted house in Edgewood. So it struck a chord, and that's been the biggest kind of bonus and surprise from publication, is that these people have, there's threads online on Facebook, and I just, I get to read them, and it's wonderful. It's like we all stepped in that time machine together.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, because you're a writer, you become the one who's telling the story of that place. You're speaking in a public way for all of those people, right? I mean, I guess in a way, did you feel responsibility because, in a sense, you're representing that place and telling a story about that place, right? So you kind of felt like you really had to get it right.
Yeah, and you know what? I didn't really feel the weight of that until publication. It was interesting because I certainly felt very similar to how I felt when I wrote Gwendy's Button Box or Gwendy's Magic Feather. I felt the responsibility because I was treading on sacred ground in Castle Rock, in the Stephen King universe. So I certainly felt a huge responsibility, and it didn't weigh on me because I knew I just kind of had to do my own thing and be confident in it. But when the book came out, I was doubly grateful that Steve wrote that preface to the second book, to Gwendy's Magic Feather, because I think it probably eliminated a lot of people asking, who the hell is Chizmar and why is he writing about Castle Rock and who does he think he is? Yeah. So I was really appreciative of that he did that. But yeah, the same thing with Edgewood. It's obviously not sacred ground in the way that Castle Rock is, but it's a real place. a lot of real people came from there and still live there. And once the book came out, the little light bulb in my head kind of went off and was like, oh boy, I hope they like it.
Well, so you talked very eloquently about the nostalgia for childhood and the great memories and looking back fondly, but you have written this book in which there is a murderer on the loose in that town. So what is it about the small town? There are a lot of stories, crime stories and horror stories, Castle Rock's a great example, all that, where you have the idyllic looking town, and yet when somebody lifts the lid off of it, there can be some ugly stuff underneath there. So there's something more complicated about small towns than just the nostalgia and the good memories, right?
Yeah, I think it's that contrast between what is supposed to be this safe haven. Everyone knows each other, or that might be like the really small towns like Mayberry from Andy Griffith, or Andy Griffith world, where everyone knows each other's names. But even in a relatively small suburb, you're at least on waving. You at least kind of have that relationship with most of the town, and it's supposed to be this safe place. And when the darkness kind of creeps in. And that's really what the book is about. It's about a 22-year-old me, getting ready to go out and face the world, returning to that safe place for a short amount of time, his parents' house, the town he grew up in, where everyone knows him, and, struggling to hang on to his innocence while the town itself is doing the same thing because this evil has invaded. So I think that's the big thing, at least some of the fascination people have in setting stories in small towns and liking to read books like that and watch movies like that, and Stephen King, more than anyone, made that popular. I think I know that's certainly one of the things that attracted, me to his work in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's scarier in a smaller community because you probably do know the people involved, or you're 1 or 2 degrees away from everybody. So if someone is a victim of a crime, you know someone who knows them, or know them, or when they find the person who's perpetrating the crime, you might be 1 or 2 degrees away from that person, which you might not be if you're living in giant Baltimore or something like that, right? So so that closeness makes it a little stranger.
Yeah, I mean, if you're growing up in an urban setting, then chances are, unless you're in that very exclusive part of town, there's a little bit of trepidation, and there's some weariness anytime you leave your home. People get mugged, people get there's hit and runs, and the whole thing. When you're in a small suburb that has a relatively low crime, which Edgewood did back in the 80s. There, like I say in the book, there was a wrong side of the tracks. So there were places where the crime was higher than others, but we really did play kick the can in the 70s and the 80s. We really did, we would have sleepovers and we'd sneak out of the house and we'd be out all night, and nobody, no one was worried about being shot or stolen off the street by a crazy person. So yeah, when those kind of things happen, and again, the contrast that with the Phantom Fondler, when that kind of became very prominent, it changed it kind of changed the vibe around town, and that's, like I said, that's kind of where the book came from, because I experienced that, I felt it, and I just thought, because my brain is warped, let's make it even worse. What could be worse? And Chasing the Boogeyman was my answer.
Yeah, and some of the reviews have compared the book to I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, which was about the Golden State Killer, who was doing horrible things, but he was sneaking into people's homes like that. And to me, in some ways, that seems like the most disturbing thing. It's, that someone coming into your house when you're asleep, and like the Golden State Killer was doing it wanted to do it when people were home, right? You think normally someone breaks into a house, most people want to break into a house when no one's home because they don't want to deal with it, right? But someone wanting to come into a house just because they know people are there, that is in some ways the most disturbing, strangest thing to contemplate, right?
Oh, he was terrifying. I mean, he would break into their home and then, and do nothing and then come back later, or he'd break into their home and hide a weapon. Sometimes I think he would hide his binding materials. And then the fact that he would sometimes in a single block, he would break into 3 homes in one night. And the fact that he wasn't caught for decades. Yeah, that book is terrifying. Someone asked me a couple of weeks ago, what's your favorite, at the end of the podcast, they had a bunch of, kind of rapid fire questions for me. And one of the questions was, what is your favorite monster? And they gave me a list, and, it was Frankenstein and, and Dracula, et cetera. And I just said, for me, I said, it's always the human monster.
Yeah.
It's always the human monster. And they asked me to kind of go on about it. And I just said, even at an early age, I loved where I grew up, but I was always thinking about, you coming home from a late night football game with your buddies, and the windows are starting to glow in the neighborhood as you're walking up the sidewalk to go home for dinner. And I was always the guy who was thinking about, who's behind those closed curtains, because we all on the outside, we all look the same, and we're all smiling, we're all friendly, but someone's wearing a mask, and what's underneath that is pretty terrifying. So a lot of my short fiction is about that, the fact that what you see is definitely not what you get in many instances. And to me, that's always the scariest thing. And that's, when serial killers became more publicized and more literature was written about them, I was, immediately fascinated, because it was like, I knew it, the freaky little kid in me was like, I told you guys. So yeah, to me, that nothing's scarier than that. Because like you said, especially in a small town, you're going to be connected to the bad guy one way or another.
It's also interesting sometimes to look back, because we're about the same age. So things that happened when we were kids that at the time we just thought were normal, but now we look back on them and say that's kind of not normal. Right. I had a really good friend when I was a kid, and his dad was abusive, but when we were kids, I didn't have a language for that, for like, this guy's abusive. And his dad was really nice the rest of the time, but he would flip his shit and be abusive, physically abusive. And so now, like 30 years later, I look back and I'm like, wow, my friend was an abused child. That was child abuse, but we didn't have a language for that. And we thought like child abuse happened, in some other neighborhood, in some other place, not my,
in like dungeons and
right. Yeah.
And the guys doing it had scars on their faces and claws. Yeah, no, I hear you. That was another interesting with Boogeyman, something I tried to kind of point out. And I think it's a universal thing, is particularly in small towns or suburbs, no one kind of knows the town better than the kids. Right. They know, not only physically, they know the shortcuts, they know the hiding spots, but they know things that a lot of the grown-ups don't even think about. They know, because they're scavengers and because they're getting into other people's business, they kind of, I always say, we always knew the best dumpsters to find the returnable bottles, to get that nickel back. Wow. But we also knew which trash cans in the neighborhood were always filled with liquor bottles. Mm-hmm. So, we didn't think of it as so-and-so is a drunk, but we always knew his trash can was filled with, hard liquor bottles. We knew which parents beat their kids, and not just a spanking, but, really beat their kids. We knew a lot of things that we shouldn't have, and we were young and pretty innocent. So we didn't do anything with that information, but we knew it. And to me, that's always a pretty fascinating thing, because, kids are, they see and they hear things that grown-ups, often miss.
And probably that adults underestimate kids and behave differently around kids than they do around other adults. And then the kids see that and remember it, and it imprints on us for years, but maybe the parents never saw this side of a person, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And especially back then, now, and I'm a parent to 2 boys, so I'm right in there with the rest of them. But kids kind of fill a different role in modern society than they did back in the 70s and 80s. A lot of times you were kind of invisible, like you said, to the grown-ups. So they certainly were more comfortable, doing their thing and saying things, because a lot of times they kind of didn't even realize you were there. You weren't the center of every family's. And I grew up in a great family, but still, your parents were like, all right, we're going out tonight. We're going over so-and-so's house for dinner. Make sure you're in bed by 10. Whereas now it's like, you can come with us, or I have a sitter for you, or, it was just a different time.
Yeah, I can remember my cousin's house when I was a kid. The adults would party in the basement and they'd send us upstairs, and we would listen through the vent. Yes. Because then you could hear the adults talking through the vent. I can remember lying on the floor with my cousins around a heating vent because you could hear the voices coming up, and we wanted to know what the adults were talking about. They never knew we were listening to them, but they were downstairs drinking and smoking and drinking and whatever. And we were like, oh my gosh, Uncle.
That was a great image.
Yeah,
Yes, no, that's a great image of all of you laying around listening.
Yes, and that's how we found out my uncle was a serial killer. No, I'm kidding. We didn't find that out. So you kind of touched on. I just want to talk just a little bit about your writing life in general. You've written tons of short stories, and your short stories are excellent. You've written scripts. Obviously, you've written novels, novellas, co-written books, and everything. I mean, is it easy to go back and forth between the different genres? Like, how do you know an idea is a short story idea or a screenplay idea, or it's going to be a novel idea? How do you navigate writing in these different genres and or different lengths and everything? And how do you manage that for anybody who's a writer out there?
It's pretty much, for me, it's pretty much just kind of ordered chaos. I don't write on a set schedule. I wish I could. I wish I did. But the publishing company and just life kind of has never allowed that for me, or maybe I've just never been disciplined enough. I like to think I get, a decent amount of work done, but it's still just never, and I'm a pretty routine person in many ways. So you would think I'd be the guy who would just get up, have breakfast, take a walk, go for a run, come back and write his 5 to 6 pages every morning, and then spend the rest of the day doing, what needs to be done. But that's never been the case for me. So, as far as, a short story or a novel, I spent so many years writing almost exclusively short stories and novellas, based on how much time I had available to myself because of working on Cemetery Dance. And, so it hasn't been until fairly recently, the last decade, that I've, done, longer length. I had so much fun writing, the last 2 projects that I've worked on were both novels, one with Stephen King called, Gwendy's Final Task, which is the 3rd Gwendy book, and that'll be out in February. And then Chasing the Boogeyman. So that, right now, I have a couple short stories I'd like to write, but I'm going to focus more on, novel length material now. And the script stuff usually comes like a bolt of lightning, and it's just, it's a film project, or I'm asked. And I turn down a lot of film work just simply because it's not as, for me personally, it's not as rewarding. A lot of times what you slave over for a month or 2 doesn't even resemble what is put up on the screen. So that, again, that's just me, but I've had some fun with, writing movies too.
And you mentioned the collaborating, because obviously you've collaborated with Stephen King. You've also collaborated with your sons on some stuff, and you've collaborated with other people. I mean, what's that like like you're writing Chasing the Boogeyman? I mean, you're the captain, you're doing everything there, right?
Yeah.
But when you're collaborating, I mean, is it difficult to go back and forth between the collaborating and the being on your own, or does the collaborating invigorate you in some way to go back and write on your own?
It's each experience is different, and people have asked me for advice with collaborations. And the biggest piece of advice I always give right out of the gate is just make sure that you're able to communicate honestly with whoever it is you're writing with. And that might sound overly simplistic or really basic, but I've seen too many people do it where they can't, well, I'm not comfortable saying that. You need to be comfortable saying whatever it is that's on your mind to the person you're working with. I think that's the only way it'll work. I wrote a lot of scripts with a childhood friend of mine named Johnathon Schaech, who grew up in Edgewood, went off to Hollywood, became a big star, was on the front cover of Esquire with like Johnny Depp and Will Smith, and was in That Thing You Do with Tom Hanks, and a lot of films. Great guy. And we wrote a lot of scripts together. Most of the time, we had the time of our lives. 2 Edgewood guys, working in the world of make-believe. And we were fortunate that we had a lot of, different projects, produced. And there was a small amount of time where it was frustrating for both of us because we're both very stubborn people. And he came from the film world, so he certainly, was kind of the boss on that side of things. I came from the literary world, so I was kind of the boss on the final say with, certain aspects of that. But sometimes it met right in the middle, and it was like, who's our deciding vote? So, and again, we're the same age, we came from the same neighborhood. So yeah, we butted heads some, and we look back at it now and we just laugh. But that's one situation where, we're older, wiser, and more mature. So, if we wrote a script together, next week, it'd be a little bit different of experience than it was back then. Writing with Stephen King was just, a dream. That was really like, the way I always describe it is just kind of like playing ping pong. I took my turn, I sent it over the net to him. He took his turn, he sent it back. Very little discussion as far as, zero discussion as far as, hey, I'd like you to do this, or this is what comes next. Once it left my hands or his hands, it was really up to the other where they took it. And there was a lot of confidence in each other and just a sense of fun. So that to me, that's how it should be, and a freedom, to rewrite each other and then, continue the story. And it was almost, especially with the last book, because it was a full length novel. It was almost like, it wasn't a challenge in that we wanted to like write the other person into the corner and say, aha, how are you going to get us out of this mess? But it was just, I took in the third book, I'm not giving away any secrets here because it's part of the advertising, but I took the story back to Derry, Maine, which is where it took place, my favorite book. And I didn't ask Steve, is this okay? It's just where I saw the story going. So I took it there and I sent it and I thought, oh boy, I wonder if he's going to like that or not. But I had the confidence to do it, and that sense of adventure to just roll with it. And Steve loved it. It ended up being, one of his favorite parts of the book. And he made it, as you would imagine, so much better, even, took it to further places than I would have thought of. So that, collaborations can be very, you use the word, I think, inspiring and invigorating. And both of them, both of those books for me were perfect description.
So what is in the water in Edgewood that you're having this successful writing career and Jonathan had this successful film career? I mean, and then you had the Phantom Fondler. I mean, like what's going on in Edgewood that all this wild stuff is happening?
I talked about in the beginning how it's very much this blue collar, working class town. And that's the thing. I think a lot of my friends, we got that from an early age through our parents and through coaches and teachers. And just kind of the basic, atmosphere in the town is that, we weren't handed anything. We didn't all come from great families, but we found a role model. I was fortunate that it was my father and also certain teachers and a lacrosse coach. And for many of the others, it was a football coach or a lacrosse coach if they weren't, if they didn't have a great family situation. But we and I wrote about it in Boogeyman about how we kind of bonded through the idea that we knew we weren't going to be handed anything. We had to earn everything. And we knew how we were looked upon by many of the surrounding towns. And we didn't care. It was okay. It was just like, if you want to put that chip on our shoulder, you can. We're not going to walk around, worrying about you. We're just going to do the work. We kind of figured out at a pretty early age that hard work was one of the secrets, and even John and I like to tell the story when I speak to groups in Edgewood. We would, because of John's position in Hollywood, we had meetings with some of the biggest studio execs out there, whether it was at Sony or DreamWorks or United Artists. And half the time we were walking down long hallways to go to the studio heads, palatial office and, behind some assistant. And we were elbowing each other. And we always said, we're from Edgewood, man. We have nothing to be scared of. And that was just kind of what we took from it.
But there was encouragement to go into something creative there in school or from parents, or was it just, was it more just the sense of, because I grew up in a relatively blue collar part of Cincinnati, and the attitude was more just like, we're not going to put any pressure on you to be anything, but just be something, right? And whatever that is, and pay your own way. So was there anybody who was particularly encouraging you in a creative direction, or was it more just find your own path and whatever works for you works?
Yeah, I think a lot of that came from the school. My family, I was one of 5 children. We were big readers, but no one was particularly, there were no singers or actors or writers. My dad was a huge reader. He introduced me to gold medal novels, and we went to the library. That was a treat for me. It was like, great, we're going to the library. And then when I was older and I started earning my own money, going to the bookstore, Carol's Used Bookstore, was kind of my home away from home, and my dad was always happy to drive me there. But yeah, for me, I had an English teacher in 10th grade named Richard Gallagher who brought in Stephen King's The Monkey. And we read that out loud in class. And I'm still close with Mr. Gallagher. He just emailed me last week that he read the book and really enjoyed it. And, we have lunch or dinner, fairly often. And he definitely set me on the course for this. He used to bring in his books, talk to me. He knew I was a big reader. He had taught both of my older sisters. And, he would loan me his own personal books. And I remember it being a 15-year-old, that made a big impression on me. But there was just a good support system. In addition to John, there was a guy named Dale Midkiff who went to school with my middle sister, and he went out to Hollywood and became an actor. He played Elvis in some huge miniseries. He played Louis Creed in the first Pet Sematary. He played the father.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And he's still out, in Los Angeles working. So again, he was in all the school plays in Edgewood High School. I remember him well. Came over to the house, often, and I just think it's interesting because we do talk about that, the alumni. There's a lot of successful people who do different things, banking and insurance, but we've had several professional baseball and basketball and football players, and people were like, how did all this come out of this little town? And I always just say work ethic and loyalty. We kind of learned to lean on each other and not listen to all the outside noise, and just understood that if you worked really hard and you didn't give up, good things would come out of it.
That's impressive. It's impressive. Now, you mentioned very briefly earlier Cemetery Dance. This might be the most impressive thing about you, is that you founded a magazine and a publishing company that has been in existence for more than 30 years now?
Yeah, we're closing in on 35.
Which is like 1,000 years in publishing terms that you've created this thing that is still going?
Yeah. I always joke that I'm a dinosaur, and the last 10 years are hugely, because of people like Brian Freeman and his wife, Kate, who worked for us for a number of years, and Mindy, who, everyone knows at the office, and now Dan. We have two, Dan Hocker and another Dan. And, I have a great crew, and anything, it's funny because, when I think our regular mailing list is 35 or 40,000 people. So anytime you're dealing with a customer base that is that large, you're gonna run into issues. And I always just tell people it's never their fault. It's always mine. They're great. And they do allow me to sneak away and write whenever I need to. But yeah, it started in '88, like in Chasing the Boogeyman. The first issue came out in December. And I talk about in the book how it was delivered to the house, and my dad helped me unload it from the UPS truck and filled up those envelopes and sent them out. And with no idea, I knew there would be an issue 2, and I didn't give any thought to there might not be an issue 3. I kind of just plowed ahead. But if you had told me then that, there would be, almost 80 issues and over 500 hardcovers and a bunch of other, trade paperbacks and chapbooks and all that, I would have just, I would have definitely thought you were a crazy person from the future.
It's really impressive for any publisher to be around that long. And you're talking about starting back in the real do-it-yourself days where you had to paper and put it in an envelope and mail it and all that. Yeah.
I spent my 20s. I always tell people I spent my 20s stuffing envelopes, whether it was putting the magazines in envelopes and mailing them, but mainly that, there was no internet. So there were no email lists. There were no email blasts. We would buy, mailing lists from different places, and we stuffed envelopes with the flyers, and we sealed them, and we put the label on, we put the stamp on, and we sent them off, and we prayed that somebody would buy something. So I spent those first 10 years just often sitting at a coffee table for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours, stuffing envelopes and hoping that we would get a good return. And there was no, it was at the birth of desktop publishing. I remember using my little black and white, early Macintosh computer. Mm-hmm. The idea of a laser printer was a dream. So I had to go to University of Maryland's computer lab and use theirs. And I still remember the first issue. I tell the story all the time. There's a big sign there that says, please do not print more than, I think it was 10 or 50, or it might've been 12 or 15 pages at a time, because it was slow. Unlike today where it spits it out.
Right.
The laser printers were slow. But my roommate who did all the artwork for the first issue, we went and we printed Cemetery Dance #1 48 pages, and we printed it twice. So we definitely broke the rule. We hit print, and it was 96 pages coming. We snuck out of the computer lab, came back like half an hour or so later, and the line was all the way out the other door. And we heard it as we emptied it. But that's how the first issue of the magazine printed.
But if only they knew, those people who couldn't print their paper that night, if only they knew that they were seeing the birth of this literary endeavor, they wouldn't have minded, right?
No, I think they would have anyway.
Yeah, they would have been pissed. So before we wrap up, just you mentioned you have the next Gwendy book coming out in February. Anything else on the horizon that you're working on that's coming? People should be looking out for.
I'm hoping to have another novel, out late next year. And I'd like to collect, 3 or 4 of the novellas that I've done, and then write a new novella and put together as a novella collection. So, and a bunch of short stories and introductions and afterwards. And, I've got 2 different film projects that could or could not go. So yeah, I mean, next year will be a busy year, and a lot of fun.
And where can people find you online? They've got your richardchizmar.com as your website. You're spending some time on social media, as we all have to do when we're promoting. So yeah, you like to interact with people.
I don't get out much, and I never have. People say, well, how did COVID affect you? And I'm like, well, besides making me, horrifically sad and worried for all of us, it didn't affect my day-to-day schedule that much, because I don't really go many places. You're like one of the few people who's actually seen me at a writing conference or a convention or, a book fair. So for me, social media was like, I had to be talked into it, 10 years ago or whenever it was. But for me, I really enjoy it. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and it's, I've been really fortunate. I can count the people I've had to block in 10 years on all 3, on one hand. I've somehow been fortunate to be surrounded by a really great group of readers and other creators. So yeah, I enjoy it.
Well, we're going to wrap it up, but wait, there's one quick question here from Moose Reviews. What is your advice for aspiring writers? Is it still the best route to try and break in with short stories? Any thoughts on that?
You know what? I don't know. My advice is really simple, and it sounds simplistic, but it's sit down and do it. And it's get that first draft down on paper. Don't try to, I made this mistake. You're trying to be too precise. You're trying to be, you're trying to reinvent the wheel. You're trying to be too this, too that. Just get the first draft down and then go back and rework it and rewrite it and revise it. And, but getting that first draft is the hardest part. And then the other part, the other advice is, kind of accept the fact in this day of self-publishing and, you can desktop publish something and make it look as good as anything that comes out of New York. Accept the fact that it's a long process. You're going to have your speed bumps, and wear those rejections and those down days is kind of a badge of honor, as opposed to getting frustrated and wanting to give up. That it sounds basic, but that's what worked for me, and I believe it's good advice. So, and as far as short stories, everyone's different. Some people kind of build confidence and build a readership through short stories. Others can come right out of the gate and write a good book. So that just whatever works for you.
Well, thanks for chatting today, Rich. I do want to just remind everybody, Chasing the Boogeyman is out now. It is everywhere. It is getting rave reviews. It is an excellent book. It is a novel, but it might mess with your head and you might think it's true crime. Who knows? But definitely read it and join that conversation. Rich, thanks so much for chatting, and good luck with everything. No problem. Good luck with